Bonjour, bienvenue tout le monde à ce colloque des sciences mathématiques du Québec. So today our speaker is Mikael Kuusela, who is an assistant professor at the University of Carnegie Mellon University since August 2018. So before Mikael did a PhD in statistics at EPFL in Switzerland, then a postdoc at the University of Chicago and at the SAMC. Mikael's main research interest is in developing statistical methods for complex data set in the physical sciences. So he has many collaborations with physical scientists through the CERN, the NASA, and the Argo program. So today we'll talk about some spatio-temporal methods for analysis of oceanographic data. So Mikael, thank you very much for being here with us today. We are very pleased, and I will let you take the floor and share your screen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mary. So let me see if we can do the screen share here. So yeah, can I just confirm that this is working fine? You can see my screen. And
yes, perfect.
Cool, very good. So thank you very much for the introduction, for the invitation to give this talk. So what I will be talking about is recent work we have been doing on extracting the effect of or the signals that tropical cyclones cause in subsurface ocean from this very exciting Argo flow data. So I will talk about all of those things in detail. But the point is that doing this important scientific analysis has various statistical complications, and we have basically developed a new statistical framework for extracting these signals, in a way that is better than before. So the first thing I should point out is, my co-authors here. So Addison, they're listed there in the bottom of the slide. So Addison is the grad student who has been actually working on this. So he has done most of the hard work here. And the rest of us have been kind of, supervising him on this work. Anne Lee is my colleague here at CMU. Donta Chiclio is a faculty member in oceanography at CU Boulder, so she's an oceanographer. And Kimberly Wood is a faculty member at Mississippi State, and she's a tropical cyclone scientist. So that's our team here. So it's a true interdisciplinary effort, including contributions from the domain scientists. So I will first talk about the data, which is very, very interesting and exciting, and kind of is the source of many of the statistical complications here, which are these Argo flow data. And basically, since I left Switzerland, as Mary mentioned, I've been working quite extensively on this data since then. So since I got here in the US, and so these data are super exciting. Because they encompass all kinds of complicated statistical issues. So first of all, what are these? So these are autonomous devices that measure this kind of vertical profiles of temperature and salinity in the global ocean. And this is where we believe these floats currently are. So there's about 4,000 of them. They're deployed in the global ocean. And they, kind of autonomously every 10 days, they go up and down in the ocean and measure these kind of vertical profiles of temperature and salinity. And the reason we do that is that we want to understand what's happening in the ocean. We want to understand what happens in the subsurface ocean, which is very important for climate science, for weather prediction, and for understanding how our planet works, basically. So that's why these data exist. That's why these devices exist. And the reason I'm interested in this data is that actually doing that analysis involves all kinds of complex statistical questions. And this is sort of within the realm of spatio-temporal statistics and data analysis. So just a bit more specifically how these floats work. So here's a kind of a schematic of what these floats do. So basically, most of the time they drift very deep in the ocean. They drift at 1,000 meters depth. And during that time, they don't really do much of anything. Then every 10 days, they go even further down to 2,000 meters. And then they start to come up to the surface. And when they come up to the surface, they measure this vertical profile of temperature and salinity as a function of pressure. So the basic unit of data we have is this vertical profile of temperature and salinity as a function of pressure. And when the float reaches the surface, it also gets a GPS position fix, and then it beams that data, and including the kind of the latitude, longitude, and time to a satellite. And then that data is distributed online very quickly after it has been collected. So now these 4,000 floats, they do this completely autonomously, and they kind of pop up every once in a while and send their data to the satellite. And then there's this big database that is actually publicly available that anybody is actually free to analyze that contains those data. And these floats have existed for something like 15 years or a bit more right now. So there's actually quite a large amount of data available to analyze. Now, this is very interesting, both because of the science questions that are associated with this data, and then the statistical questions. So that's why, at least I personally find this area very, very exciting. So let's maybe first start with the science. So what are the kind of the big science questions? So these floats, basically, these data are more or less the only data we have for subsurface ocean on a global scale. So this is a completely unique data set. There's almost nothing else that gives you this information for the subsurface ocean. And the subsurface ocean is actually very important for the climate system. It's, for example, important in terms of a storage of heat in the planet. It's very important in the global carbon cycle. It, of course, there's, everybody knows about ocean currents. So that, those actually, these data contain information about the ocean currents. And then, the topic here today is tropical cyclones, and tropical cyclone signals you can see in this data, and that's within the realm of air-sea interaction. So, all kinds of, important large-scale climate science questions. Now, statistically, why is this interesting? Well, the main point is that this is a complex spatio-temporal data set. So first of all, there's a huge amount of data. There's about 2 million, that's actually probably more these days already. So there's more than 2 million profiles. And each of those have up to 1,000 vertical observations. So if you think about it that way, there's basically more than 2 billion spatio-temporal data points to work with. But these data also have complex structure, so they're not on a kind of a regular grid or anything. So it's very irregular. It's non-stationary from a statistical perspective. We now have a lot of evidence that the ocean is non-Gaussian as well. So it kind of breaks all of our usual assumptions, which is of course interesting for a statistician. And also, this is actually sort of a rare example of a 4-dimensional space-time data. So you have latitude, longitude, and time, but then you also have the depth, right? So there's not too many other sort of big data sets like this that have this 4D structure, which again is an interesting aspect, and many other extra complications. So it's a very fruitful area for statisticians to interact with geoscientists and make actual, scientific progress. So the specific question I'm going to talk about, so I've worked on various aspects of this data, and we've actually worked more or less on all aspects of these problems, and many of the statistical problems as well. But what I'm going to today talk about is a specific project where we have looked at tropical cyclone signals. So in US, tropical cyclones are called hurricanes. So here's an example of a few recent hurricanes that had a pretty devastating impact on US and nearby regions. So the first one on the left is Hurricane Harvey, which is the one you might remember is the one that devastated Houston, basically flooded Houston. And on the right is Hurricane Maria, which is the one that devastated Puerto Rico. So both of these were extremely costly natural disasters. And that sort of serves partially as a motivation for these studies. Hurricanes are one of the costliest natural disasters globally. So it's very important to try to understand when they happen, why they happen, how they happen, what are the kind of the driving forces of these big storms, and how are they maybe going to change as we go through climate change. There's also another aspect of this. So tropical cyclones, because they're so intense phenomena, actually, it's hypothesized that they have important impacts on climate and specifically heat transport in the ocean. So it's believed that these big hurricanes and tropical cyclones might affect the way heat is transported around in the ocean and in the climate system. So understanding sort of the interaction between the ocean and the storm is important, first of all, for understanding how the storm is driven by the ocean, and then also how the storm potentially affects back to the ocean. And as I hope all of you know that, these storms are driven by heat from the ocean. So that's the energy that drives these storms. So, we should be able to sort of, relay. I mean, these two things are very much connected because the heat energy that drives the storm comes from the ocean. So, okay, so what's the sort of the history of our analysis here? So, around the time I started here at CMU, I happened to see this paper, which is, I have this figure here on the left from that paper by Kevin Trembert, where they looked at, in fact, this Hurricane Harvey, so it's the one that went to Houston. And it just turned out that there happened to be a few of these Argo floats on its path. And they basically plotted the profiles these floats happened to see just by chance. Like this is not like designed, to be like this. They just happened to be there on the path of this storm. And if you look at these profiles, you see that there's a huge and very clear change in these profiles before and after the storm. So basically what happened here is that, as the storm went over, it basically sucked up heat from the ocean. You see it in these temperature profiles, you see this very clear signal where the ocean temperature goes down as the heat is transported to the storm. And one thing that's important to highlight here is that it's really the depth aspect of this. So it's not enough to see what happens at the surface. In order to understand how much heat did the storm suck up from the ocean, you need to actually have that vertical information. And as I emphasized, there's almost nothing else than Argo that can give you this vertical information. So any kind of a satellite measurement of sea surface temperature, for example, it would only see the top few centimeters of the ocean. It would not have this vertical information. So you see here, like basically you see changes all the way down to maybe 80 meters at least from this storm. So that reminded me of a paper I happened to also see a few years before, which is this paper here, the figure here on the right is from that paper. And they actually did this very sort of innovative analysis of Argo flow data and the relation of those data to tropical cyclones. So basically what they did was that they looked at sort of pairs of profiles before and after a storm and tried to quantify how the temperature of the ocean changes as a storm passes over. So first of all, I thought this was super exciting. This is a very interesting kind of data analytic problem here. And secondly, I felt that we should be able to actually improve upon this previous approach. So we were very much motivated by these two results, and especially the one here on the right. And we looked at the way they do things, and we thought, okay, we can actually probably do or at least produce a more sophisticated version of that analysis. So basically, well, okay. So before I talk about our improvements, let me just show you some of the first things we did as sort of exploratory data analysis. So okay, so we want to see for ourselves. Okay, do we really see this drastic effect? Like, do we see these changes in the profiles? And it turned out that yes, especially if you look at these stronger storms, it's actually quite easy to see this. Or at least find a few examples of these signals. So we looked at the other big hurricane that happened the year before, which is the Hurricane Maria. And also there, it just happened to be actually around the time when it passed over Puerto Rico, it just happened to be that there was a few of these Argo floats on its path. And we then looked at profiles from these floats before and after the storm passed. And again, you see the same effect. You see that the temperature goes down as the storm passes. And in fact, it actually affects the ocean even in a more complex way. So you basically see there's this sort of this kink in these profiles, which has to do with the ocean physics. So that kind of goes down. This is called the thermocline, and it affects the thermocline. It kind of stirs up the waters of the ocean. So there's, at least kind of two things happening here. One is that you see the temperature going down, then you actually see the thermocline decreasing and to some extent even maybe becoming kind of sharper than it was before. So okay, so now, but these are just individual, just by chance we happen to see this. This doesn't allow us to sort of systematically understand what is going on. So in order to do that, we wanted to actually do something similar to what these guys did here, which is to study the impact we see in the ocean as a function of basically space and time and depth. So we basically take this approach from this Cheng et al. 2015 paper and build a more sophisticated model on kind of their basic idea. So what is the basic idea here, and what is the basic strategy they originally kind of pioneered? The idea is basically that you build this kind of, well, first of all, you're looking at Argo profiles that are close to tropical cyclone paths in order to see some effect from tropical cyclones. So the very first thing you need to do is to look up those profiles. So we basically need to correlate the locations and times of those profiles with tropical cyclone tracks. And then the second thing you want to do is to look at basically these pairs of before storm and after storm profiles. So you want to identify these pairs of profiles where one happened before the storm and the other one happened after the storm. And so we call the before storm profile, we call it the baseline profile. And then the after storm profile, we call a signal profile because it might contain some of that tropical cyclone signal in it. We also regard that these profiles are close in space, so that effectively the only effects we are seeing are effects of time passing and then potentially the storm passing. So we do not account for potential kind of spatial variations because we regard that they're close in space. And then what we want to do is to basically look at these differences between the signal profile and the baseline profile and try to characterize that as a function of space, time, and depth. And try to sort of build this three-dimensional understanding of what's actually happening in the ocean. Now, so this basic idea of like pairing these profiles is from this original paper, but we improve upon that in many sort of various important ways. So the first one is that in this previous paper, they binned the time. They did not treat the time as a continuous variable, which of course simplifies the analysis quite a bit. So we wanted to actually treat time as a continuum, and specifically we're here talking about the time after the storm passage. So we basically characterize these signals as a function of the impact we see after the storm has passed. So what's happening in the wake of the storm, in the ocean. Then the previous paper also didn't account for the seasonality in this data. So that's another thing we built into our model. And then finally, we modeled the variability in the ocean and propagated through our analysis to get rigorous uncertainty quantification, which is also something that is new on top of what was there before. And all of these are non-trivial statistical tasks, and I will talk about our approach to each of these during this talk, but that's sort of what we're aiming to do here. Okay, so let me just show you here first, the first step, like number one here. Look for the profiles that are near the tropical cyclone tracks. So here's one track. This is again Maria, so again the one that went over Puerto Rico, and they're now here looking for profiles during within the track of the storm that they're close to the track, both in space and time. So it's not enough that you have a profile which is near the track in space. It also has to be there during the time that the storm actually passed. So, if you're somewhere here in the middle of the Atlantic, it's not useful to look at the profile, which was 20 days before the storm. Or, if you're looking here at the Caribbean, it's again, you're not useful to look at the profile, which was 20 days or, well, let's say a month after the storm passed. So we basically require, we first kind of filter our global database of these 2 million profiles to look for those that were nearby tropical cyclone locations, both in space and time. And then what we do is that we transform those to this coordinate system that is sort of centered on the storm passage. So we basically, so first of all, they're building these pairs, right? So in each of these cases, we also require that there's a pairing. So we have a pre-storm profile and an after-storm profile. Those are the only cases that are of interest to us. And then for those pairs, we then basically we want to understand, how does the signal profile relate to the passage of the storm? And the natural coordinate system for looking at that is basically this, what we call d tau coordinate system, where d is the cross-track angle with respect to the track of the storm. So this is the angle with respect to the center of the planet. So you basically, it's the opening angle on the surface of the planet between the track of the storm and then the profile location. So that's the x-axis. And then the y-axis is the time since the passage of the storm. So one thing also that's good to highlight here is that the Argo floats, they sample every 10 days. So that the time scale of that sampling is actually not particularly great for resolving tropical cyclones. They're not designed for doing this. It just happens to be that if you're careful, you can actually extract some of the signals. But part of the challenge here is that the sampling frequency of 10 days is actually much larger than the typical time scale of a tropical cyclone passage. So, so it's not that frequently that we get observations like this, but if we look at enough of them, we can actually still resolve signals. So, for example, this figure, this shows for Maria, where, our data are, if I pick up, a point here, this one, for example, would have been a bit to the right from the track. And here the signal profile occurred about something like 6 or 7 days after the storm had passed. And this is the sort of the signal part of the paired profile. So somewhere before the storm passed, there was a baseline profile. And then we are looking at the change between that baseline, which was somewhere before the storm, and then this signal profile that occurred after the storm had passed. So then we do this globally. And we basically have a database of tropical cyclone tracks, so here's the tropical cyclone tracks over the past few decades, more or less, during the time we have Argo data, and you might be surprised by where these are if you're not a tropical cyclone scientist. So tropical cyclones happen in most ocean basins. And we just happen to usually hear of the North Atlantic ones, but there's a lot of them in the Pacific and also in the Southern Hemisphere. So we loop through all of those, we correlate those with the global Argo database, and we fill in this space here. So basically, after that, we have here a pretty good collection of these pairs of temperature observations, and this is basically our raw data at this point. So each of these is a pair of a baseline profile and a signal profile plotted on the coordinate system that relates to the passage of the storm. And then we want to look at this and extract a signal from this data. Another thing I should point out also is that we do this at one depth level at a time. So effectively this picture will look basically the same for various depths. Argo flows sample all the way down to 2,000 meters. So in principle, we could go that deep. Most of the signal is in the upper layer, so we focus on the upper few hundred meters, and we do it at some grade of depths within that range. Okay, so now let's talk about the model. So a very big part of this project was actually to figure out what is the model, because it's actually quite it's sort of trivial once we have written it down, but beforehand it was not at all trivial. So after a lot of thinking, we realized that this is the right model to kind of model this data. So basically, we have our baseline profiles, and then we have our signal profiles, and it's useful to decompose these into components. And what are the components here? So the M here reflects the climatological mean of the ocean. So this is the average state of the ocean. This is sort of your normal year condition of the ocean. Then this A is what is called an anomaly in climate science. It's the deviation of the current state of the ocean from the mean state. So for the baseline profile, that's all there is. We assume that there's no other signals there. So we basically have the mean state and then the current deviation from the mean state, which generated our baseline profile. And by the way, the M here is deterministic, and the A is more as a random field, as we'll talk about in a second. Then for the signal profile, it has the same two components. It has also that climatological mean. It has the anomaly, which reflects all the non-tropical cyclone ocean variability. Then on top of that, it might have a signal from the tropical cyclone. And that signal is indexed by these d tau coordinates, by the tropical cyclone coordinates. So that was one of the kind of complications. It took a while for us to figure out that there's really kind of two natural coordinate systems that are mixed here. There's the Earth coordinate system that kind of characterizes all the normal behavior of the ocean. And then there's the coordinate system from the storm. And they two are actually mixed here in the signal data. And in fact, so this is sort of like, this is effectively an ANOVA model, right? So we have basically our baseline observations, and then we have observations with a potentially extra component. And we want, under this ANOVA model, we want to now infer this signal component. And we want to infer that as a continuous function of d and tau. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, a natural approach, I already talked about these pairs, right? So, first of all, each of these is a paired set of observations. And secondly, I talked about, well, the natural approach to do here is to look at the differences within the pair. So that's actually what we do. So basically what we compute from our data are these differences between the signal profile and the baseline profile. And then under the model I just wrote down, it looks like the one here. So what we need to now be able to do is to model each of these components. So at the end of the day, we want to get the S, right? That's our signal of interest. But in order to do that, because it's kind of, you know, convoluted by the M component and the A component there, so we need to be able to model those and deal with those in order to extract the S. So effectively, you know, so if you look at this, basically what happens with the M here, you basically have the sort of the change in the climatological state of the ocean between the baseline profile and the signal profile. But since we record the profiles at the same location, this is effectively just capturing the seasonal cycle. So the only difference here is in terms of the time, which for the mean field basically reflects the mean change in the seasonality between those two profiles. And then for the anomaly here, it's sort of the same thing. It's again in the same location, but we want to understand how these two are random fields. We want to understand how correlated are those two random fields across this time difference from signal to baseline. So now what we need to do is to be able to model those M and A, and that will allow us to extract the S. And the nice thing is that so both the M and the A, they reflect to, they relate to the non-tropical cyclone variability and state of the ocean. So the nice thing is we have a lot of data for estimating those, because we have many more profiles that didn't have a tropical cyclone in them than the ones where we have the tropical cyclone signal. So we use all of that other data to estimate the M and A, and then eventually we'll then, you know, use that knowledge to extract the S from the tropical cyclone profiles. And by the way, whenever I use this acronym TC, it refers to a tropical cyclone, just to be clear. So I will talk about all of those steps in detail, but let me just, before we talk about the details, let me just kind of show you the high level picture of where this is going. So this is like a pipeline of our analysis. So what's happening here is that we start with this, you know, our data or the tracks, and then our Argo profiles. And as I mentioned, we just look at like one depth at a time, and then in the end we sort of connect those, but we'll see that, you know, in a bit. But at this point we are just looking at, you know, one depth at a time. Then we divide those to the tropical cyclone profiles and the non-tropical cyclone profiles. Then we use the non-tropical cyclone profiles to fit basically the seasonal cycle. Then we subtract the seasonal cycle and effectively the whole climatological mean from the data we have. Then we again use the non-tropical cyclone profiles to fit a Gaussian approach model for the anomalies. So that's the random field model we're going to use. That will give us estimates of the basically the dependent structure within the anomaly component of those tropical cyclone profile pairs. And that will finally allow us to fit a template spline for the S component, the signal component that we care about. So that's what is going to happen here now. So I'm now going to talk about each of these green boxes in some more detail, but, you know, in terms of what we're doing there. So first, for the mean field. So what we use for the mean field is basically a local regression. And this is something that actually has been successfully used in oceanographic literature before. So there's these two very nice papers where they show that this is a good idea. And I can concur, this is a very good idea. So I tried, you know, I tried various other things, and it turns out this is very difficult to beat. So this is actually a very good way of modeling this data. And so again, what we're doing here is a local regression. So basically what we're doing is that we fit locally a sort of a second order polynomial in latitude and longitude. And then we also have in our local fit, we have a seasonal cycle in terms of sines and cosines. So those sort of harmonics there will capture the seasonal cycle. And all of this is fitted within a local window. So that this picture here is trying to kind of illustrate that. So we basically take a local window, fit this local regression model there, and then use that to figure out what was the mean state at the center point of the window, and also what is the seasonal cycle at that center point of the window. And then we do this as a moving window. So when we move to, you know, we do this on a sort of a grid of locations. So we move to the next grid point, we refit the local regression model, and that will give us a slightly different fit for the mean field and the seasonal cycle. And this idea of local fits is very good for ocean, because it turns out it has a lot of fine scale structure. It's very difficult to capture that using kind of any kind of, you know, other type of modeling. So at the end of the day, what we really want to get out of this is this difference in the mean fields, and effectively, as we discussed, it really boils down to the difference in the seasonal components at the two times that we observe. And this, we do this fits using the non-TC profiles because we don't want this to be biased potentially with the signal that we are trying to infer. So let me show you how this works. These plots come from a slightly different study, but they kind of give you, it's the same model, so they give you an idea of how this model performs. So here's temperature data. This is a global set of, this is actually basically the whole Argo database at 300 meters. And then we do this local regression. So we pick a sort of a small local window, we fit that local regression model, and then we you know, ask what is the fitted value at the center point of the window. And this is what it looks like. So this is the locally fitted smoothed surface from this data. So these were the raw data. This is the fitted mean field. And you see it really does a very good job. It captures very fine structure that is true physics in the ocean. And you see it, you know, the field has pretty complex structure. So we need to do something like this. And this changes with depth also. So we need to fix this at different depths. So we do that, you know, we basically have this kind of same kind of a global fit for the tropical cyclones. But in that case, we only care about, you know, what is actually the impact for the actual, you know, signal profile locations we care about. So this figure basically shows the final part of this fit that we actually use in our analysis, which is the seasonal cycle for those paired tropical cyclone observations. So this shows you the sort of effectively the seasonal change within the pair. And you see that, you know, it can either be positive or negative. This is at 40 meters. This also depends on the depths. At different depths, this looks a bit different. But you see that, you know, it's a non-trivial fit we get. But, you know, we believe that this is a good characterization of the seasonal effect within those profile pairs. So, okay, so now at this point, if we go back here to our model, that allows us to characterize this difference in the M's, which is a deterministic effect. So this was easy to model and it's also easy to get rid of. So basically what we can now do is to take these M's, we now have a value for this difference. So we can just flip it to the left-hand side of this equation and effectively subtract it from our data and basically seasonally correct our data that way. And that's actually what I have here on the next slide. So basically what we do is that after this, we basically make a correction for the seasonal effect and look at these Y's where we have our raw data, then the seasonal correction. I just flip those M's to the left side of the equation. And what is left on the right-hand side? Well, we still have our signal, and then we have this difference in the anomalies. And now, so again, the signal, we think of this as a deterministic effect, but these A's are a random effect. They're a random field. So we need to model them as such. And so we need to come up with a model for this difference in these A's. And for that, we are going to use Gaussian processes. And effectively, we're going to use an approach that in my previous work, I have found out to work very nicely for Argo floats. So we are going to use something called locally stationary Gaussian processes. And the reason for that, okay, so first of all, what is the idea here? So the idea is that the ocean is very strongly non-stationary. So the covariance structure of these anomaly fields, these A fields, varies very much depending on where you are in the globe. So, you know, if you're within a strong current, the dependent structure in the ocean is very different from, you know, when you're surfing some kind of calm region. So statistically, it means that these random fields are very non-stationary and in ways which is very difficult to model. So again, a very good idea, and kind of going back to what we saw with the mean field, is to do things locally. So what we basically do here is effectively a moving window Gaussian process. So we pick a small window of ocean. We fit a stationary Gaussian process within the window. So we assume that locally within that small window, things are close enough to stationary. So we can fit a stationary model. But then we do this in this kind of overlapping moving windows. So whenever we move to our next location, we refit the stationary model. And we kind of capture the locally most relevant structure in that area. And the benefit of this is that, well, so first of all, this is quick to do because we only work with these small subsets of data at a time. But secondly, it allows us to capture this non-stationary structure without ever having the model for it. So it's very similar to these local regressions. We can capture very complex global structure by fitting simple local models. And that's actually what is happening here as well. So in a bit more detail, what we are doing here is that, so first of all, we already dealt with the mean effect, right? So we have a model for the mean field. So we subtract that from our data. That gives us sort of mean-centered data, in this case, temperature data. So we subtract the mean fields, and then we have these t tildes, which are sort of, this is supposed to be mean zero observations. And if you're looking at the non-TC data, the only thing that they have now, because we have dealt with the mean field, are these anomalies, these random fluctuations around the climatological mean. Those we want to model using these locally stationary Gaussian processes. So basically, the model is that we say that our temperature observations come from a Gaussian process. We assume that Gaussian process has a stationary covariance. So this K here would be a stationary covariance. I'll show the form for that in a second. And so we say that, okay, we have this sort of dependent random field for modeling the temperature, and then we have what in this context is called the nugget effect. So we have which here refers to fine scale variations in the ocean. So that's our model. The other thing that is also worth pointing out here is that these data have natural repetitions in the sense that it's natural to think of each year's anomaly as being an IID replication from some underlying process. And that's actually what we're exploiting here. So we actually have many replicates from our random field, which is going to be great for estimating the parameters. So this is actually very useful for us, because under this model where we say that each of our years is an IID replicate from some underlying process, that actually makes the estimation of the covariance parameters much easier. So okay, so basically what we now need to do, we have the parameters of our model are these thetas of our covariance, right? And then the variance of the nugget effect, so the sigma squared. And this theta is a vector. I'll show you in a second what it is. And then the sigma squared. And those are the ones we want to extract from the data. And again, the reason we want to do this is because those are the parameters to capture the appropriate dependent structure in the anomaly field. So okay, so we want to, under this model, we can write down the likelihood function, and then we can do maximum likelihood for extracting these parameters. So that's what we do. And just as a reminder, again, all of this is done in local moving windows. So we actually loop over the ocean and re-estimate those parameters as we move with the window. So I promised to tell you what the covariance function is. So the one we are using here is an exponential covariance. And if you're familiar with this area, this implies certain things about the smoothness of these fields and so forth, but it's a pretty reasonable choice. And then we account for anisotropy, which is actually important for ocean. So the ocean is strongly anisotropic, so we need to account for that. So we have two length scales. We have one in terms of latitude, one in terms of longitude, and then a temporal length scale. And all of those we estimate from the data. And again, for each grid point, we do a separate MLE of these parameters. And effectively what that gives us are actually parameters that are functions of space. And so effectively you can think of this, because of the non-stationary, those parameters vary as you move in the ocean. So let me show you what these parameters look like. And again, this comes from a slightly different study, but it's illustrative for what we do with the tropical cyclones. So these are actually from this paper I referenced here. So basically these show that these parameter estimates are stable and makes a lot of sense. So if you look at these parameters at different depths, this would be the total variance of my field. So the phi is the Gaussian process variance, and the sigma is the nugget variance. And you see that there's first of all, there's no strong non-stationarity in the ocean. So areas like the Gulf Stream are much more variable than some colder parts of the ocean. And also this changes a lot depending on where you are and at what depth you are. So it's important to be able to model this. And this local fit is very attractive way of modeling this, because we never had to model explicitly where these effects are or what kind of variations we expect in these parameters. It was all kind of data driven in a very natural way. And there's a lot of physics here that I will not kind of go through, but a lot of this makes sense to the domain scientists. We can look at the length scales as well. So this is the longitudinal length scale, the east-west length scale of our fields. And you see that the ocean is non-stationary. It has longer length scales near the equator than towards the poles. Also longer length scales near the surface than at depth. It's also anisotropic. So if I make the same plots for the other length scale, the north-south length scale, that tends to be much shorter than the east-west length scale. So you need to account for the anisotropy. Okay, so we make those fits again. And again, these plots show the relevant parts of those fits for the tropical cyclones. So underlying each of these plots is, again, figures like this. These are the actual models we fitted. But in terms of the part of the models we actually use, so these parameters evaluated at the locations and times of our profiles, this is what it looks like. So basically on the top, we have the Gaussian process variance. On the bottom right is the nugget variance. And on the bottom left is the temporal length scale. These are the parameters that actually affect the things we want to do. But in order to extract these, we needed to fit the whole model. Like we couldn't, like we want to get, for example, the temporal length scale, but we couldn't get that without accounting for the spatial length scales just because of the kind of data we have. So we had to fit this, actual, spatio-temporal model in order to extract the parameters we care about. So, okay, so these are the fitted parameters. Again, it all kind of makes sense, checks out, looks stable enough. And so then, now let's see, how do we actually use this? So what we want to do is to basically, and just to remind you, just to take a step back, what we want to know is the basically the distribution of this difference, which effectively, it's also the same as the difference in these t tildes, because the left-hand side of this equation are those t tildes. So we want to know what is basically the variance and potential covariance in those t tildes. So so we want to get the variance of what I call these y's. These are the seasonally corrected data we have, which is the difference in the t tildes. And in order to do that depending on those a's, which are now modeled using this Gaussian process. So from the fits we have, we can now extract the relevant things we need in order to get the variance of this difference. So effectively, we need the marginal variances of our data points, and then we need the covariance between our data points. And as you can see here, it depends on the phi, it depends on this nugget variance here, and I'm missing a square here. There should be a square here, but it depends on basically those parameters, and then it depends on the temporal length scale. So those are the things we actually use from the fit. But in fact, this is actually a bit more complicated. So this would be the case if I have a single baseline profile and a single signal profile. However, what actually happens in practice is that a single baseline profile can be associated with many signal profiles. So imagine that you have this one float and it samples every 10 days. So so we can have an observation which is like right before the storm passed, and then we can have a few signal observations even within, we're looking at 20 days since the passage of the storm. So even within 20 days, we can have at least normally 2, but in some of these flows sample more frequently. So we can actually have up to 6 of the signal profiles associated with a single baseline profile. And now the problem is that those are all correlated. So, and we need to account for that, and that actually impacts our fits. So if we just, for simplicity, let's talk about the case where we have a single baseline profile, 2 signal profiles. All of these, this is a vector of 3 variables, and they're all correlated. But now the nice thing is that we can extract the correlations between these from our Gaussian process. So nicely, again, basically, this is the covariance. If you ask from your Gaussian process, what is the covariance between these? Well, it's the covariance function that we feed it that tells you what the covariance is. So we again get this from our model, and then what we care about at the end of the day are these differences between a signal and the baseline profiles. So these are the things we actually look at in the end. So the nice thing is that those are just a linear transformation of the t tildes we have modeled using the Gaussian process. So to make a long story short here, we can get the covariance of even those kind of lineages of many profiles from the fit we have. And we do this up to 6 signal profiles from a single baseline profile. Okay, so that's how we use that Gaussian process model we just fitted. And I will convince you in a second that it actually is important to do it like this. And this makes a difference. And then just the final part of our fit is the thin plate spline fit. So at the end of the day, we want to get an estimate of this S, right, the signal. And so at this point, what we have is that our data are this wise. These are the seasonally corrected temperature differences, and so since we have now a Gaussian process model for all of this whole thing is just some Gaussian. It's some high dimensional Gaussian, where we know the covariance structure from our Gaussian process fit. It's basically, you know, what we just kind of extracted here. So this sigma here is a block diagonal covariance. So blocks corresponding to these lineages from a single baseline profile. So you know, we can extract that sigma from that. And then we have the mean effect, and the only mean effect we could now see are these signals that we care about. So that's the last thing that we want to now model here. And the way we do it is with a thin plate spline. So we want to model this as a function of d and tau. A natural way of doing that is some kind of a smoother. A spline is a natural approach here. So we basically fit this using a thin plate spline. We use the appropriate base expansion that goes with sort of a certain type of a thin plate spline, and then we fit it using this is a Gaussian, so we know it's we know its likelihood. We knew also the covariance structure, right? So the first term here is basically just the Gaussian likelihood that goes with our model here. These R's and L's are the basis matrices that go with our thin plate spline base expansion, and then we put there a smoothness penalty basically to get reasonable fits. So at the end of the day, we do this kind of a penalized GLS where the weights for the covariance were extracted from the Gaussian process model. Here we need to pick the lambda. We basically use a sort of a leave one out cross-validation type of approach for doing that with some small details there, but effectively we get it from our data. So we do that fit by minimizing this objective function there, and so from that we get our fitted spline, right? And then the other thing we get from it, we not only get the spline surface, but we get its variance as well. We get its variability, which we can use to quantify uncertainty here. So we get our fitted data Y and their variance, which is easy to do because it's just a linear smoother. So given that we can model the covariance of Y, we can just propagate with the hat matrix the variance from Y to the Y hats. And then we use our 95% Gaussian confidence intervals or prediction intervals in this case to quantify the uncertainty of our fits. And again, these fits are trying to quantify the tropical cyclone signal. So at this point, I have basically shown you the method. So now we are going to use the rest of the time to look at pretty pictures of our results. So the first thing I want to convince yourself is that the things we talked about make a difference. So the first one is the seasonal cycle, and these plots show you the effect of the seasonal cycle. So basically on the left is raw data, and this is actually raw data with a bit of smoothing just to make the picture look a bit more kind of manageable. So these are raw data. And you sort of see here, if you look at the raw data, it's sort of like, there's like almost like a warm bias towards the end, right? It seems warmer towards the end than it was here in the beginning. And that's the seasonal cycle you see there. So our estimated seasonal cycle is shown in the middle there. So you see this is there's a warm bias towards the end from the seasonal cycle. So this depth of the ocean on average warms up as you move in time after the pass of the storm. And then when we correct for this with the seasonality adjustment, we get something that doesn't show the warm bias anymore. So that's the effect of the seasonal cycle. Then the effect of modeling the dependence carefully is shown by these figures here. So on the left is a type of a spline fit. This would be the one where we just would have a diagonal covariance, so no modeling for heteroscedasticity and dependence. And you see that it's kind of blurry, and then you see just like this streak here on the left. So we actually looked at this streak. It turns out that this is something like 6 profiles from some float near the Philippines that just happen to be in warm waters. There's nothing wrong with the float. It's not a tropical cyclone. There's no tropical cyclone there. Okay, so there was a tropical cyclone based in the plot, but it was not an actual signal from a tropical cyclone. It actually was a background effect, but it was not part of the signal. And when we account for the dependence, we basically realized that these 6 profiles are very strongly correlated. And in the fit that accounts for dependence, this effect is much reduced because it kind of realizes that really we just had here very dependent fluctuation that kind of showed up in this plot. You also see that this kind of becomes sharper when we account for all of these effects. And then finally, the other thing we get from these fits is the unstring quantification. So the figure on the right shows you the basically the way we make these plots is that we mask out those parts of this plane where we don't see a significant effect according to 95% confidence intervals. So it's effectively doing a test at a 5% significance level for whether we had a 0 signal or potentially a non-zero signal. So in the place where we can reject the 0 signal hypothesis, we show the plot and we mask out the place where we cannot reject that hypothesis. And now you can see here is that again, it was very important to do that because now we can actually see that we have nothing significant on the left and on the right, but we do have significant signals here in the middle, which is exactly what we expect. This is at where the storm passed. You actually see here a cooling effect. This is at 10 meters here, so you see a very strong cooling signal that extends up to 20 days since the passage of the storm. So this shows you that it was important to do the careful statistical modeling. So now we can kind of look at the actual sort of concrete results and see what this gives us. So here, so as I mentioned, we do this at many depths. So this is showing you 10 meters, 60 meters, 150 meters. And you see that the signal looks different at different depths. And for example, here at 60 meters, you see an interesting effect with the right of the storm. You actually see a warming effect. And that's real physics, we believe. First of all, it's significant in our fits, and there's a good physical explanation. So basically the rotation of the storm and the movement of the storm cause more stirring onto the right of the storm than to the left of the storm. And that stirring basically causes vertical mixing of the ocean that causes warm waters to propagate to this depth. So that's why you see this blob of warming in otherwise sort of cooling signal. But that doesn't extend to great depths. And by the way, so this could not have been done with the previous analysis. So previous analysis did not give you this resolution in time. They did a binning in time. They had just basically 2 bins in time. So this is the first time you're actually able to do this a continuum of time. We can also look at this. So here I'm like looking at like horizontal planes. So we can also look at this as sort of like vertical planes. Or effectively what we're doing here is basically we look at sort of chunks. Let me maybe clarify here. We basically make a cut on one side of the storm or the center of the storm or to the left of the storm. And then we plot this as a function of depth and time since the passage of the storm. So we basically in the 3-dimensional space, we just sliced in a different way. And you see here, this is showing the asymmetry between the left and the right-hand side. So on the left, so left figure is the left side of the storm, then the middle of the storm, right side of the storm. And you see this warming blob, for example, I mentioned. So it's mostly here at depths of something like 50 to 120 meters or so. So these are pretty cool. But then we actually realized that we can actually push this a bit further because we basically now have in this 3-dimensional space of time, depth, and the cross-track angle, we have estimates. So we can actually make a 3D plot as well. And this is what it looks like. And when we saw this, we were like, this is really cool. So I definitely want to show you this. So this is now a 3-dimensional characterization of what we are seeing. And you see here, so we're looking at this from different angles. So the first one is sort of like looking at this from the front left. This middle one is sort of from the behind, and this is like straight from ahead. And you see here sort of that the main effect is that you see this like cooling at the center. That's where the storm sucks up the heat from the ocean. And that effect exists for at least 20 days. And then you see the warming effect to the right of the storm that has to do with the vertical mixing, but that does not exist to the left and also doesn't go very deep. It's also actually not at the surface. It's actually this blob at a certain depth. And again, this was not possible with the previous method. This required a continuous modeling in time to make these plots. Then we can, of course, check that we actually reproduced the previous method. So this is more or less what the previous method did. They looked at the binning in time. They had a sort of a 3-day bin, which is sort of the time and the storm impacts the ocean, and then they have sort of the cooling off period after 3 days. And the figure on the left basically reproduces their results, so it's very consistent with what they had. The figure on the right actually is slightly different, and we believe this is because of the seasonal cycle of the model. So they didn't have a model for the seasonal cycle. Actually, their plot shows a mild warming effect, which might have to do with the warming effect we see from the seasonal cycle. Of course, it's very, it's a regular different analyzed different time period. There are all kinds of technicalities that could also cause this, but a plausible hypothesis for the warming effect they saw in this right-hand side plot would be a seasonal cycle, which was not accounted for, while we do account for it, and we don't see warming at these timescales. Okay, so that's actually, and that's like right on time, I believe. So that's basically what I want to show you. So basically, first of all, these Argo data, I've worked on these like 4 years now, and it's just like, it's such a great source for interesting problems. So I have just 2 new students started working on this, and it's just that there's an infinite amount of things you can do. The second thing is, of course, this contribution we have here, which is this new framework for analyzing the subsurface ocean thermal response to tropical cyclones, and we discussed the improvements that this gives over the previous approach. And the technical tools for this were this local regression fit, the locally stationary Gaussian process, and template splines. And this can be brought much further. I maybe should not go through the list here. I just mentioned a few things. For example, I mentioned that we regard the floats to stay at the same location in our pairing, but it actually, with more advanced modeling, you could account also for drifts in the floats, and you could get much more data by doing that. So that could be very interesting to look at. It would be interesting to put more covariance to the S. Like right now, we only regressed on the tropical storm coordinates, but actually you should really look at this also as a function of latitude and the storm strength and so forth. So that's a clear improvement. And we could also look at other phenomena, like things like atmospheric rivers, or for example, how does salinity change? So there are other kind of physical quantities we could also look at, or other phenomena. So all of these, there's so many further directions for this work here as well. And in fact, our collaborators have started to use this technique. So Donata, who is one of our collaborators here, now has a student who's looking at the salinity effect, for example, using these techniques. So if you're interested in finding out more, we have the paper and archive. So this is the reference there. And we also have all the code on GitHub. So if you want to reproduce this or try out some of this yourself, all the code is available. The whole pipeline from raw data to the plots we had is on GitHub. And just to wrap up, I just want to mention, this is part of this STEMS effort we have at CMU. So I'm running with one of my colleagues, we are running this research group on statistical methods in the physical sciences. And we are very interested in basically developing statistical methods that apply across physical sciences for analyzing large and complex data sets. And the reason for this is that there's a lot of commonalities in terms of things like spatio-temporal data, ill-post inverse problems, unstream quantification, many other things that connect these fields. So this has become a pretty active effort for us. And one of the things we do is to run public webinars. So if this is an area that you find interesting, you can sign up on our mailing list. So you can go to this link here where you'll find the mailing list. So if you just Google STEM, you'll probably find it. We just actually had one right before this. So I just came from hosting that webinar. We'll have one a month later. We'll actually have a speaker at Mary and Leo will recognize coming up very soon. So if you're interested, you can listen in to those. They're public. Just sign up to the mailing list. You'll get the Zoom link there. And yeah, with that, I'll wrap up. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So thank you very much for your attention.
Cool. Thank you very much. This is a really interesting talk. We have some time for questions. Is there? You can maybe raise the blue hand or just unmute yourself. Okay, anyway, I have a few. It looks super computatively intensive. Like, how long does it take? Like all these local things, like for all the grid is huge. Like, can you just comment a little bit about this?
Yeah, so it turns out that the computationally most challenging part are the Gaussian process fits.
Yeah.
Although those are actually quick in terms of how, as far as Gaussian processes go, and the trick is that it's all local. So we never have, so the issue with Gaussian process, you need to invert this big covariance matrix, and that's slow. So the big benefit of doing things locally is that you only need to invert local covariances, and with the windows that we typically use, that means that we only have some like a few hundred data points in one covariance matrix at a time. So those are very tractable to invert. So that's why it's slow but doable. And the rest is, so the local regression fits are pretty quick. The spline fits are pretty quick. It's a Gaussian process that is slow. Also, some of the pre-processing is a bit slow, but you know, it's all of this we did actually do at our local cluster. Some of this other work I have done on an NCAR supercomputer, but this we actually did on our local cluster. So it's definitely doable within, like, you know, typical university resources. Okay. But you do need like a cluster to do this. Okay. Okay.
I have yeah, there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, or
yeah, I have it open here. Let me see what they have. I'm not sure if I understand the question. I don't know if the person who asked the question would like to clarify a bit what they mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm not sure if I actually understand the question. If we can have a clarification on what the question exactly is, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, please, Orson, you can unmute yourself. I don't see it.
While we wait, Mikael, I was wondering, so when you had these gray area for the, I guess, the difference in the fitted, the spline, the thin plate spline anomaly, how do you just do the test pointwise, or do they somehow, they account for the spatial correlation in any way?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's why I have here on the list, like handling of multiple testing, because this is a multiple testing problem we have, and we don't currently account for that. So we simply do like each of these. If I just go to one of our plots, well, any of these is a good example. Each of these tests we just do it pointwise, and we do not correct for multiple testing, which is of course not great, but you know, you have to kind of start somewhere. Handling multiple testing for spatial data is very non-trivial. It's something that I'm definitely interested in, but I'm also not aware of like super great ideas there. So if anybody has suggestions, I'm more than happy to, you know, hear about interesting or relevant references. As far as, I mean, it's a problem, but I also don't have very great solutions in mind. But it's also something we haven't really looked at super carefully yet.
And I was wondering for the conclusion, like, with these kind of data and like analyzes, like, yeah, the temperature change in for the cyclone, do they, I mean, I guess you're not interested like in predicting something like the specialist, like the oceanographer, like what question really they wanted to answer? Like it was really just to be sure that the temperature was changing after, before and after, or do they like want to go somewhere else?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. So yeah, so I didn't talk about sort of the exact scientific use of this, but let me just tell you, based on our discussion, what I know at least, which is that if I go here, so for example, this paper, one of the points of that they had was that they were actually able to relate this change here, and definitely the integral of this change, to the amount of rainfall that fell on Houston. So for example, these changes can be related to the amount of moisture that the storm is able to contain, which then of course connects to the rainfall effect it has. So if we kind of extrapolate from that, then effectively, if you look at our figures here, for example, let's take this one here. Effectively, the slope here, or the depth of the deepest point, in some sense, should be a measure. It's a measure of how much heat went from the storm to from the ocean to the storm. And that connects first of all to the index of the storm, but it also connects to the amount of water vapor the storm is able to contain. And all of those then connect to the to the impact it actually has. So that's one use that I know of. There's also another aspect of this. So one is to understand, what's going on with the storm, and this is the exchange that the storm has with the ocean. But the other aspect, as I mentioned in the very beginning, is that these have connections to climate science. And so one of for example, there are papers where they put out this hypothesis that these storms, they stir up the ocean so much that they're able to basically inject energy to deep levels of the ocean. And if they did that, then that would have impacts on the heat transport on a planetary scale. And the fact that we are not really able to find evidence of that, like this seems to kind of more or less stop at around a few hundred meters. And an effect, it's a cooling effect. We actually don't see a warming effect at depth. There are hypotheses where you would see like warming effect at depth. So that kind of analysis can be used to, sort of confirm or refute some of those theories that have been proposed for the impact that these storms have on sort of the climate of the ocean, which then affects, of course, weather and temperatures globally. So that's another kind of aspect of this. And I'm actually very interested in talking to domain scientists to understand better how they would use these effects. But those are the two things I know of, from the top of my head, but there's probably many more as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, is there any other question from the audience? Okay, if not, maybe Mikael, you can stay just a little bit, and like if people want to ask you some questions.
Yeah,
and otherwise, merci tout le monde d'avoir assisté à ce séminaire et bonne fin de semaine.